Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar on strategies for moving from a network-centric to a data-centric protection model. First, to go over some logistics, we will be handling any questions during the webinar using the Zoom Q&A question interface. You should be able to see a button on the bottom of the screen titled Q&A. And you can ask questions during the webinar, and we'll either try to answer those during the webinar or at the end. We'll have some time reserved for Q&A. The second thing is that this webinar is going to be recorded. If you anyone who registered for the webinar, whether or not they attended, will receive a link to the video after the webinar. And you can share that with anyone that you like, anyone that you think might find it useful. Also, just to give everyone a heads up, we did schedule this webinar for an hour. We've got a lot of content to cover today, so we may go a little bit over, but we still will have time for Q&A at the end for anyone who is able to stick around if we go past our initial hour. So what we're going to be covering today, I'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll be talking about some of the data security challenges for the digital economy, specifically how to safeguard information sharing using a data-centric security model. I'll go through some common practices and approach and talk about a data-centric security solution. And then finally, we do have some use cases and demos that we'll go through. Finally, at the end, we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. So to introduce who we've got today, there's myself. I'm Tony Burning. I'm a senior product manager at NextLabs. And then also from NextLabs, I'm joined by Peter McPherson, who is a senior account executive, especially focusing on the federal space, and Steve Brown, who is our solution architect. We are also joined today by Steph Charbonneau, who is a senior director of product strategy with Titus Help Systems, as well as by Ryan McGee, who is a senior manager for Accenture Federal Services. So with that, I think we will dive right in. So first, let me go over some of the data security challenges that are unique to the digital economy, and especially as the economy digitizes more and more. It's become ever more important to really control and secure access to digital enterprise data. However, even though you do need to you do need to control access to that critical data, it's also more and more important that you can share information globally. That's both internally for distributed geographic teams, as well as to partners who are collaborating on the design and production of products. So that makes it very challenging to safeguard the intellectual property that that corporations have, that companies have. And still keep it protected while also meeting a more varied array of international regulations or industry regulations. What this really means is that as systems, corporations get more distributed, you no longer can rely on a network-centric security approach to safeguarding your data. There no longer is a very clearly defined perimeter that can be guarded. And you still need to be able to allow employees to access that data and work on it for wherever they may be accessing it. Again, whether that's from home in situations like we are in now with the pandemic forcing everyone to work at home, or just globally distributed teams that are all working together remotely in different time zones, different physical locations. So here's a way to really visualize how those digital security requirements are changing. In the old requirements, employees would be everything was internal to a company, so everyone would be an employee, but now there's a much more varied workforce of having partners, customers, even outside collaborators that are all contributing to a product, to a company. Applications used to all be on-premise, installed locally, but now so many more of them are in the cloud or on remote systems. Instead of just email, you actually have social sharing, you have other messaging platforms, other ways of sharing information. And you no longer just have everyone with their own desktops. So whether laptops are coming in and out of physical corporate locations, or people are, or employees are using their own devices, or even just mobile phones, having proprietary data on mobile phones, it's a much more complicated environment for controlling access to information. And then finally, for the differences in use cases, instead of just securing specific data, you want to be able to really take this data and share it securely, so that everyone does have access to it, but you're not compromising the integrity or the security of the data by allowing everyone to have access to it. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ryan McGee to talk a little bit more about network-centric security versus data-centric security. So Ryan?
Thanks, Tony. So what is network-centric security? So this is a security model that's using something like an isolated physical server location, some server definitions, perhaps a discrete network, in order to protect your data. So most of you listening probably have some model that is very similar. Hopefully you have more, but this is really what network security is. And so to oversimplify, right, this is what what Snowden did, right? So he had access to the network, and once you get behind the firewall, if there's nothing there, even if you don't have a need to know, if there's nothing protecting that, you're getting a lot of access to data that you really should not have access to, just because the only protection with a network-centric approach really is at the perimeter. So if we go on to talk about data-centric security. So data-centric security is a bit different here. We're using really a zero trust architecture. We're assuming that our network is going to be compromised. And so we're not just protecting the perimeter. We're building on that, but this is really the first line of defense. And so the data view, a data-centric model, we are viewing the data as that key asset to secure. So we are now going to shift that focus really downstream and make sure that the users at the time of execution, at the time a user says, I want to see, such and such piece of data, that's when we're going to do the checks, and we're going to say, should you have access to see that? Perhaps a quick example would be, would you be comfortable purchasing a home without any locks, without any security features at all, in a gated community? If that home was was in a gated community, my guess would be no, right? You're happy with the gate, but you'd be even happier if, to protect your own family, you had locks on your doors, locks on your windows. And so that's what data-centric security is doing for us, is we are protecting in a much more granular level down to the data itself. So if you want to go to the next one there. So some of our drivers here, right, is really just the inadequacy of strictly a network security model. So the state-sponsored cyber attacks, our adversaries have been getting smarter. They've been getting better about this. We've got inadequate measures in some places, and then homegrown attacks or insider threats are always going to be a challenge, but are especially a challenge in kind of this network model. And then the last somewhat challenge here is, there's always a trade-off in some sense between security and usability, right? Security and flexibility. And these network walls, as people have gotten used to, are actually fairly inflexible. So you've got now cloud services, mobile, increasing globalization, and you've got users that are trying to and expecting a pretty streamlined experience, and a network approach is not only less secure, but it's not going to give you that. Right there, it's a fairly inflexible approach for today's data and how that data is stored and accessed. So this is why the federal government is requiring new cybersecurity measures, promoting, and this is really what it is, it's a corporate culture shift. We've got to prioritize protecting the data itself in this data-centric model. And these new regulations are applying everywhere across federal agencies. You can read about some of those here. the NIST 853, Rev 4 and 5, the DoD's Master Cyber Control Reference Framework, as well as in the RMF, the new Security and Privacy Controls Manual for all federal information systems and organizations. So how this works together, you might have a requirement or a policy at this top level here. So we'll walk through that. So only allow, your policy might say, only allow a manager, so a specific title, specific function, that is a U.S. citizen working in Division M on Region X with access to nuclear maintenance data, so a specific subset of maintenance data in SAP ERP only during working hours from an office location to perform actions 1, 2, and 3. So some of this you might be used to seeing as maybe you've got some, some of this is traditional network security. Some of this is going to be your traditional role-based access security, probably those user actions and what they can perform. Maybe even user attributes to an extent can be RBAC. But how this data-centric approach works is you're using all the tools in your tool bag, right? You're using network security, you're using role-based access controls, and you're using attribute-based access controls. And it's all of those together that gives you not only the greatest flexibility, but the greatest security, because you're able to be much more granular in terms of how you're controlling and how you're writing those policies. So that's really what it is we're building on really what you've got today. So reusing role-based security, that starts, that's network security is probably where it starts. But when we talk about application security, role-based is really where we go to with that. But again, it only supports coarse grain access. And so this is much more fine grain access when we talk about data-centric approaches and attribute-based approaches. And so if anybody has used an SAP system, you probably know that a lot of the security with role-based really is all or nothing. So if I'm going to access, for example, a purchase order that has 5 lines on it, and maybe I'm only expected to pay one of those lines, just one of those lines goes to my organization. So in that model, what are my options? Well, I can not have access to the purchase order, right? Wouldn't be able to see it at all, but then I wouldn't be able to pay. So that doesn't work. The other alternative would be to give me access to everybody on that purchase order. And that may be giving too much away, right? I don't have a need to know what, everything that's on there. I only have a need to know my line. And so with these attributes, using attributes, using your roles, using your network security, you're able now to actually get much more granular. And now we're able to show that user, here's the one line you have access to pay. And they can go do that. They can still do their jobs, but they have, essentially with this zero trust, they have only access to see what they need to do their jobs. We don't need to show them everything just to do, kind of one little thing. So that's the beauty of the model, is it's greater security, but it's also greater flexibility. And so, again, kind of like we had just talked about, right? You're granting access and denying based on, some policy rules. So some mix of classification, you're going to classify your data. Titus is going to talk about their product later. You're going to mix in user information, contextual, environmental clues, and all of these things are working together at the time a user is executing. So that at time, from the time a user says, I want to access this piece of data, we're doing all these checks to say, should you be able to access that data, given who you are, where you are, the time of day, all of these clues go together really in order to form that attribute-based security model. This is kind of this data-centric approach. So to summarize, this network security approach is a good starting point, but we've got to do more. And so with the zero trust, with data-centric, with attributes, we're assuming that the network is going to be, we're assuming the network is compromised, and we're working backwards from there. So we're working in a data-centric approach. We're not just going to rely on network separation or perimeter security or even only user roles. We're going to go beneath that, and we're going to shift the focus downstream. And we're going to manage the risks that are associated really from the inside out rather than from the outside in. The example here is, this is what I worked with NextLabs on. So our data statement, our problem statement here from one of our DoD partners was they needed to prevent unauthorized access to organizational data across the SAP landscape, but they did not have a consistently defined master data element across the landscape. So that's what we were working with. We came in, we performed a study and analysis. This was just Accenture performed the studies and analysis to assess potential solutions. We did try, can we use standard SAP for this? Are there commercial off-the-shelf products? This is where NextLabs came in. NextLabs was chosen. It was really one of the only in this space. This was a few years ago now, but we conducted a design build with them, with NextLabs. And that solution actually went live in March of 2020. We have not had any security spills to date. So the solution that we've implemented using attributes has actually gone very, very well for this particular client. So some of the things that we noticed, easier to maintain, troubleshoot, and audit. So we don't have to work with thousands of roles, thousands of different derived roles to handle all these elements. Neither did we have to rely on all or nothing security. So that was a huge positive for us. And then audit is very simple. We can easily see who has access to what at any given time. And then this next one is important. So easier for end users to provision. If you could imagine trying to provision thousands of roles with the right combination of attributes to get the users what they need, that's overwhelming. And what that leads to is, in that example I gave, if one user tries to access that purchase order, they don't have access, they say I should have access. What's going to happen in order to get them access is they're going to get elevated access, right? They're going to have essentially to be provisioned for all those commands in order to access only what's on that purchase order. But now your security model that you've designed really is starting to break down because you're having to give more access because you're not able to give access at the fine grain level. And so we've actually simplified the provisioning here by collapsing the derived roles and making that much easier for users to understand exactly what they're getting access to. And then, so again, this is what we were built on, right? We had network security. We used SAP's role-based architecture, and we added to that the attribute-based architecture. And like I said, the solution has operated very, very well in production. So I think over to you, Peter, to talk about a few more use cases.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Folks, I'd like to introduce a customer who has been very, very successful in applying what we've learned so far today. But just one housekeeping issue, just want everybody to understand and know that anything that we're using here today, we've gotten written permission from Centcom to be able to talk about it, and everything is in the public domain. So Centcom is one of the 11 unified combatant commands under the DoD. And it's been around, and one of its main missions has been removing or reducing terrorism since 9/11. Now, the interesting thing is it's made up of a coalition of 47 to 50 countries, and each one presents a unique cybersecurity challenge. So when Centcom started out, it didn't have these coalition of countries. And the traditional way to manage security was through a network. However, with 47 different countries and umpteen missions within each country, the networks exploded. Each coalition and mission required a new network. Why? Just simply, the network security was based on ABAC security, role-based security, and it was just not narrow enough. It could not give narrow enough access to have multiple coalitions and missions on the same network. Data spilled into each other. The warfighter couldn't share information, or if he did, in many cases, the wrong people were looking at it. So mission flexibility had unintended consequences. Huge cost in network, personnel, hardware, and software. The outcome was every coalition or mission required a network change or addition. So we've been working with Centcom now for 3 years. And they came to us as early adopters. They wanted to employ a data-centric environment and using attribute-based access control software in order that the warfighter could now, for the first time, be on a network, share information on the network in order to accomplish the mission, but also not have other people on other missions not interfering with his or her data. The good thing is now the mission commanders can now collaborate and conduct operations without having to get a new network each time. This allowed for the collapsing of these different disparate networks in order to support an individual mission. It is now moved into a single network, a single reusable network, instead of the huge number of previous networks that couldn't communicate. The benefit: people talk, commanders can communicate, the mission can go forward, and there is a significantly increased partner trust. We're now going to look at practices and processes to safeguard sharing information. Then we will relate what we have learned with demos. Through all of this, software is being used to achieve data centricity. And note the words automate or automation in this slide are being used 5 times. Whenever possible, automation is used to safeguard the data-centric process and workflow to remove negligence and fraud caused by the interjection of the human element. We'll look at these proven practices in the following section. So let's start out. The 5 elements to data-centric security. It's helpful to break down the individual components of a data-centric solution. Let's start with identity. We haven't really talked a whole lot about identity, but identity hasn't gone away. It's still really important. But with identity, what kind of data from customers, feeds, downloads, portals, and applications generated are the full things that fill out the things associated with identity? Then, is the data worth protecting? Is it low threat? Is it sensitive? Or is it regulated? You really have to understand the sources and sensitivity of the regulated data, where they're stored, how they're used. Is it shared and how? Is it structured from an application, or is it unstructured from a spreadsheet or file repository? And then in number 4, the right protection means the controls used for the protection are very important. So there's a whole notion that you have to get the control logic correct in order to implement the right amount of protection. And we're going to talk a lot more about audit than we have in the past. And audit is proving to be very, very important. It all has to be audited. There are 4 main components for a data-centric solution. And we are going to address the 4 boxes on this slide over the next 5 to 10 minutes. Classifying and labeling the data. Then we only protect data that needs protection. Sounds reasonable. And we do it at the perimeter. Yes, don't forget the perimeter. And we do it again at the atomic level, at the most granular level, at the source. And that's at the data centricity level. We do it using a policy engine, a centralized policy management engine. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in a few minutes. And we do it in real time so that we can address at the moment the user hits the enter key, we can determine from a true data-centric zero trust architecture at that moment, is that user aligned with all the right attributes and the right measurements for them to get data. All of this done is to improve compliance. And if you didn't want to do it in real time, you don't have to. You can do it overnight, low periods of use, whenever. So now let's take a deeper look with an introduction of classification explained by Steph Charbonneau, Senior Director of Product Strategy, Data Security with Titus Health Systems. Steph, over to you.
Great, thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. Great to talk to everybody today. So as we're outlining a data-centric solution here, the first step, trying to put the controls in to make sure that the right people are getting access to the right information, is really to understand the data. So how do we label this information in a way that can apply all the stuff we've been talking about so far? So and we start thinking about that. The more information we know about that data, the more that we can put the controls on, the more we can control it to make sure it's going to the right people and not getting into the wrong hands and going through that process and allowing us to get to that fine-grained control that we've been talking about. Now, as we start thinking about how to classify or tag our information, we're not just trying to get into a DLP type solution and blocking certain access to it, but really trying to get all the context of the information out of that information in a way that's meaningful to the infrastructure and also to the people. If you look at the right side of the slides here, you're seeing a kind of hierarchy structure. If you think about the data within your enterprise, it might be broken into different business units. You might have some research information. You might have some HR information, finance information, and then broken down to subsections as well. And so we start looking at all this unstructured data that's flowing through the environment. We really need to come up with a process that allows us to tag this information, but with enough context for us to make those decisions that we're trying to get through. And that really leads us to those last three questions we see here on the slide. So how do we actually go through that process in a meaningful way to work with our users and work with that data so that we can take advantage of that? And then how much information do we need? And then our three labels, talked at the beginning of the process, Ryan said, over the oversimplification of just because I have top secret clearance, for example, I had access to information, maybe I don't need to. So I need to come up with something that maybe is not as simplistic as like 3 levels of classification, but something a little bit more meaningful to that. So, and if we start thinking about the information that's there within the environment, we need to come up with a taxonomy, a way for us to label this information in a meaningful way so that they come through and allow us to control that data. We might, and here are some examples of these buckets or what we call categorizations of information around the data that might exist throughout your infrastructure. You might be looking at from an angle of sensitivity. Is the information a certain classification that a certain personnel needs to have enough clearance to be able to see that information or not? So I need to understand the data from a sensitivity level. And then maybe I start looking at the distribution of that information. What are the characteristics of the data that might want to confine that data within a particular country, maybe physically and maybe from its citizens as well? If I understand from a data perspective what restrictions are on that data from a distribution, then I've got a lot of great information for us to take advantage through this ABAC solution as well. And not just from a security perspective, we start thinking about managing our data. There might be some outside influences and regulatory constraints within the missions and within your networks that'll need us to tag and keep track of personal information that flows through in a way that that we can make sure we're not compliant. And even with the military, people are responsible for that. So we need to come up with a map that allows us to kind of incorporate all these different perspectives, different categories, and then apply that and look at the information from that perspective. And when needed to, do I need to know about the sensitivity or distribution or privacy or these different regulatory when I'm starting creating these policies around the data handling within my environment? Now, as we go higher in the stack of the importance of either from a restriction perspective or the value to the organization, we start to focus on those because we may need to go one step deeper in understanding out of the most sensitive information. Maybe I want to control the applications that touch it, so I have a really good understanding about the flow, natural flow for that information based on some of the sensitivity. And when we think of data classification as a whole, so I don't want us to leave here thinking it's just a simple label when you start seeing these things called like secret, top secret, and these simple labels that you may associate to classification. But really we're talking around taking these structured data identifiers, these buckets, these categories that I come to define my taxonomy for all my data within my organization and from both internal and external with my business partners or coalition partners. And I take values of those data classification values, then I'll apply a label. Here's an example of this one. You can see in the middle of your screen around classification. It has a sensitivity associated to it and has a distribution control to it and perhaps some regulatory. And maybe in this case, there's no privacy constraints on it as well. So take the things that matter to it, apply it to it. And we're talking about 2 different ways of getting to that outcome. One is to apply a visual label, perhaps to let that user, the person receiving the data, or the person who's going to read that information, understand its sensitivity. but also from a metadata perspective, where we stamp that information so that the downstream technologies understands the value of that data and applies the right policies to that. And so when we think about data classification, it's really the intersection between working with the user, making sure there's a taxonomy that makes sense to that person, and then leveraging, where possible, some automation. You would have heard earlier in the session talking about trying to get to an automated solution as much as possible. People make mistakes. We want to help them along. So either through suggestions, and depending on the risk tolerance within the organization, you may go all the way to fully automated to find these labels. And maybe it's around the privacy side. And then we apply the label at the bottom right to the data itself. So we'll get into these when we start looking around use cases. But for this part of the solution, the first step is identifying that data, labeling it, and then getting to the security controls, which is the bottom left here, which really talks about the second stage of getting into a data-centric solution. So I'll turn it over to Peter for him to go through the second part.
Thanks, Steph. And thanks for that overview on classification. And that sets me up to talk about safeguarding data at the source. It really is, after classification, all about safeguarding the data. 90% of business critical data is created and managed in applications. Therefore, the key to data centricity is focusing on access within an application. This focus, this attention, takes place after the user is granted access to the network, but before any data or access is requested. NIST calls this dynamic access and devotes a whole bunch of controls to its proper implementation. By the way, this is the first time that NIST has really addressed dynamic access in a real and important way, and says it's the future behind the future way that access must be created. Why? Because the assumption is that any and all networks are compromised. Remember how we talked earlier that the network is only the first line of defense. You have to focus on safeguarding data at the source, control which users have access to which type of data, enforce policies to data across the application. How do we do this again? Don't throw RBAC, role-based security, out the door. Build on it and move to a hybrid ABAC, attribute-based access control, to augment RBAC when RBAC cannot be fine-grained enough and cannot get down to a data centricity level. Again, you do this with data classification, segregation, risk mitigation, and activity logging. There's a new sheriff in town, and it's NIST SP 853. Ryan talked about it for a few minutes at the beginning of the presentation, and this is the baseline security. It is the foundation security reference document for the RMF, don't groan, yes it is, FedRAMP, etc. And the interesting thing is that out of 1,492 controls or control line items within NIST 852, 200 of them are devoted to access control. Unbelievable, for the first time, 100 are devoted to audit. And I know you folks won't believe it, but only 70 are devoted to identity. In other words, access control has ascended as much more critically important than identity. NIST realizes that truly the network is only the first line of defense. We've alluded to fine-grained data access. That is the much finer lens than role-based security can be used for giving access to users. Let's take a look at individual kinds of fine-grained access. Who can access the data, from where, when, what, and how. That would translate into a policy where nuclear engineers at Ship Station 5 between 1,000 hours and 1,800 hours can access drawings on device X. You have data security controls, the view level, the field level. Everybody understands masking, scrambling, enable, disable. You also have data filtering, chopping off a section of the data. While one person receives the whole email, somebody else only receives half, because the second half of the email has content that they are restricted from being able to get access to. Data segregation is a lot of fun, and it was really important for our customer Centcom. And it's very, very important in the IC community. Whitelist, blacklist, physical storage servers. A Centcom coalition partner can update servers in Canada, US, and Australia, but not in Germany. Policy-based management of content on physical servers. Separating data that should not be seen by foreigners. Restricting download to approved locations. An engineer in a shipyard, and I must apologize, I've used shipyard a number of times because a number of folks that have signed up for this seminar are from our leading industrial shipyards. An engineer in a shipyard can send engineering documents to a US citizen with a clearance X to US and Japan only. Preventing spills or retaining content within a geography. It can be real time or be done in a remediated batch process. The user, the data, the devices, the networks can be assessed and measured every time the enter key is hit, or the information necessary to grant access can be updated only when appropriate. We also go since this is a policy engine, we also go very much into transforming typical business policies into controls. Classic example is SOD violations. Create a fictitious vendor and enter a vendor invoice for automatic payment. A number of folks here have SAP. SAP has over 350 SOD controls that could all be automated very, very simply using this technology. And it can be done through any industry: purchasing, banking, bank settlements, manufacturing. There are probably tens of thousands of SOD controls just uniquely waiting to be automated. And finally, the user experience is very unique. It's seamless. They don't know what's going on. It's beneath the covers. We spent most of our time talking about protecting data on premise or in the cloud. However, there's a need to protect data after it leaves the user. Protection does not stop on premise. We will be devoting a whole set of seminars on the topic for protecting data on the move. The same rigor to support data centricity protection can be applied for the life of the data or the document after it leaves the server. Again, the data protection is transparent to the authorized end user. Policy-driven or user-initiated classification goes and lives with the protection of the document as a digital right. Protection of persistent data protection, no matter to what level, goes with the data. What if a sensitive document from the White House could only go to U.S. citizens in the U.S. with a watermark ID of the sender, and it could be viewed but not copied, and it only lasted 5 days? There would be a whole new take on data leaks out of the White House. But this is technology that is absolutely available today. So finally, let's close the loop on compliance and governance requirements with audits. According to NIST, now audit is more important than identity. Remember, I said identity had 70 listed control lines. Audit has 100. With policy-based audits, you conduct data-centric monitoring, data-centric auditing, and analytics. Attaching the audit function to a policy, we can initiate special audits and analytics automatically on high-risk users, devices, or applications. We gain new ability to gain insight into risky activities, anomalies, and process failures. The DoD and NIST recognize how important audit is. And with a policy engine behind the audit function, we're delivering a whole new way in order to manage and improve the process. Steph, I'd like to now turn it over to you, and let's take a deeper dive into the specific use cases that we've prepared for you today.
Thanks, Peter. Hey everyone, let's take a look at these use cases. We have a series of use cases where I think we can get into seeing some real examples of what we mean by the theory we've been talking to date. In this first case, we're going to walk through the actual process of applying some classification to some information. But the scenario here we're going to talk through, and then these use cases will all flow together. But the first one will be, we're going to take the role of an analyst. And the first person you see in the column on the left-hand side there. We have 4 people who've come together as part of a coalition. We have a mixture of Americans, Canadians, and they may be based in different locations. And here you're seeing some examples, either in a US location or a Canadian. They have certain clearances to their to information they have access to, whether it's secret or top secret. And also in this taxonomy, we're talking about communities of interest, or COI or COI, where they have access to specialized programs or smaller communities. So you can think about these as networks. And in this example, we're going to walk through, so Anne's the American analyst. And in this first use case, she'll be sitting in a US location where she's going to create these 5 different documents you see on the right-hand side. And we'll walk through the process of how do we classify, how do we tag this information and get this to the coalition group. And then we'll look at different, in the following use cases, about what controls are in place to protect the information, make sure appropriate information is being read by the appropriate person, and perhaps within an appropriate location as well. So we're just going to switch over to the demo now. So now we're going to take a look at some sample use cases where we're going to create the information for our use cases. The first case is to go create 5 documents. And so we're going to connect in as Anne, and Anne is going to be located in the US at this point. So we're going to go ahead and connect as her on an American machine, and she is an American citizen with clearances up to top secret. And we'll review this as we go through the process. There's a series of documents she's been working on here. So we're going to talk about the act of classifying this information, and we're going to walk through the process of seeing that there are some choices here in the very first document. It's not classified yet. If I come to save the document, I could be forced for that user to classify the information. And these lists can be very dynamic based on your case, or whether or not they're allowed to actually create top secret or different levels of classification. The other thing we can help the user with as well is information that at a certain level, there are some of the other criteria we talked about applying to that. So whether or not a citizenship or location-based thing is important for a country, we can mark it with a releasable to, which would tell the system that it should only be within certain constraints. Or if it's something a little bit more sensitive, then we can introduce some other elements, whether other controls or communities of interest of what they have access to. For this case, we're actually going to just go through and just simply create this first document, which will be an unclassified document. I'm going to go ahead and save that. It's going to apply some visual markings to the document itself and the metadata that we talked about in the previous section. So go ahead and close that document. That one's done. It's ready for the rest of her community, which is a compilation of American and Canadians with different security levels. This next document she's going to take a look at, and we're going to introduce the idea of helping the user classify in a helpful way. So let's say if I go through and classify this as an unclassified document, it's a spreadsheet, part of the project. If I go ahead and save that, we're going to see something a little bit different in the experience. We're actually finding stuff in there, so it's helping the user along, trying to abide by the classification policy that things that with a credit card needs to be a higher classification, at least confidential. Thanks for the warning, but in fact, I'll go up to secret level for the second document. And in fact, I am going to bring that for the team. So anyone within the Canadian US environment can actually take a look at this information. We will raise it to classification. That was just, an example of the classification giving us some guidance as to what we should classify and apply the metadata to this document. Third one, we're going to get to something a little bit more sensitive, maybe. Here's another document we're going to classify. It's applying for a trademark. That's in the US. Let's say it is sensitive. We want to keep it internal to a project at a secret level, but really this will only be applicable to people within the United States of America and not as applicable to anything outside of that environment. So we're going to start creating different combinations of classification, and we're going to then see the effects in that. So we'll go ahead and save this document, and you can see some markings that is going to describe, in addition to just the sensitivity around classification, but also its releasability or where can this document be accessed. And this fourth one, an interesting one, is we're going to have something to do with a fighter pilot aircraft carrier around radar detection. We're going to go ahead and save that. And from everything else I've been working on so far, everything's been secret. So let's go ahead and do secret, and then we're going to go ahead and save that. And this behavior is going to be a little bit different because in addition to just on the sensitivity of credit cards, we're going to get something a lot more specific. In this case, we're working on a special project where it's known based on stuff we've seen before or on this new keywords or through this document. In fact, this looks like Project Tiger or COI Tiger is applicable to this document and should actually be classification top secret. And it's already set these settings for us to help that user along. So this could be automated. In this case, it's suggested so the user can agree to that. And you can see the markings are appropriate to that environment. Last document we're going to classify here, those who recognize this diagram, it's actually the iPhone, one of the diagrams as far as patents for iPhone. But for our case, we're going to go ahead and save this document for our project team. We will have it classified as secret by choice. And in fact, there's a special classification for this where we actually want to limit it to not just the fact you got a security clearance, but you need to be partaking as part of 2 communities of interest to have access to that. And it's going to be bananas and lion for this example. All right, so we'll go ahead and save this document. We will get the visual markings, the metadata on the document itself, and we are good to go. So I've just walked through the act of, Anne's come as part of the project. She's classified these new additions. She wants to share it with the team. So we're going to do it in 2 different ways. The first one is we'll go into SharePoint. There's a SharePoint up and running for the team. It's accessible for the team members, and we're just going to simply drag this up to SharePoint like we would normally do to get things within SharePoint. So we populate that, and we'll actually go ahead and check these in so people can see that the documents are ready for them to take a look at and take action on that. We'll go ahead and do the check-in. All right, so that's available for my team. You can see some of the visual markings coming through, and shortly we'll talk about what these actually mean as far as the policies are concerned. Last one is I've actually got one of these documents, sample D. I'd like someone to pay attention to that first. So we're going to go ahead and email that to the team. And if I take a look at my team members, it's the ones that we were seeing in our spreadsheet at the beginning of this. I want them to all review a specific document. So we'll go ahead and create an email. And we'll attach a sample D. I want them to pay attention now and not wait until that's available. We'll go ahead and classify it as secret. We're going to take a look at the interaction between both the email and the attachments classifications to take a look at that, and possibly take a look at sending to someone from the outside to see if they can receive this information. And from a classification policy perspective, we'll take a quick look at what we're trying to see here. So it's going through and we're seeing a couple warnings for the user to help them before it gets into the system. First one is, first of all, we're trying to send some classified information to someone on the outside. That's a faux pas. So let's go ahead and clean that up right away. We can get rid of some of the first limitations as far as, sharing that information. But more importantly here, we're taking a look at the document. The attachment is actually a top secret attachment. So the email needs to be that before I can send it. The send is blocked. Let's correct the situation. So go ahead and bring it up to the top level, top secret classification, and allow that to go through and have it sent to the team. So we're going to take a look at, you see it ends email off to the team. It's definitely external ones was removed. We got the visual marking for the people receiving this, and that's sent off. So I've shared it with the team from both the SharePoint perspective and also done it from an email perspective. And now we're going to take a look at the next few use cases on proper handling of this information. Now that it's classified, let's take a look at how NextLabs will put the controls in place to control that. So I'm going to switch it back to Peter, and Peter is going to walk us through the next use cases.
Steph just finished classifying an email and sending it. Now we're going to look deeper into security compliance requirements. In front of us, we have the table with the users and files that Steph used to show how an effective data-centric solution can be used to classify data. The slides add rules. Now, rules 1 and 4 are pretty clear, but 2 and 3 there's an important distinction. Releasable to and community of interest are both multi-value attributes, but the rules are different for each. For releasable to, a user's citizenship only has to match one of the listed countries, while the community of interest, a user must have all of the listed values. Now let's switch over to Steve, and during the demonstration, we will see how these requirements are applied in a data-centric environment.
In this next use case, we're going to use the sample C file that has been marked secret and is only releasable to US citizens. However, for the demo, Anne is going to send this file to all the other users. We will then show how data-centric policies will restrict who gets the file. So to begin with, we're going to log in as Anne, and here we see Anne, and we see where, as part of Steph's demo, he sent this sample D document to the other users. And we go to the inbox, and we can see where Anne got some notifications that not everybody got that message. Now we're going to look at this message as sample D message more closely in the next demo. But for now, we're going to dive more deeply into the enforcement process by having Anne send another email to the users with the sample C file attached. Now we know that sample C is secret and releasable to the US citizens only. So what we expect is that Chris and Dan as Canadians will not receive the email. So we'll generate the email. We're going to go to Bob, Chris, and Dan. And this is the US only attachment. So we'll go out and we'll attach sample C, and when we hit send, the classification will come up, and we'll select that it is a secret US only message, and it's sent. And so we quickly get the notification that Chris and Dan did not get this message because of the releasable to attachment. But if we go down to Bob's inbox, we see that Bob did get the message. And more importantly, we see that Chris and Dan are no longer on the to line. And so whatever follow-on communications related to this message, they're not going to be part of the conversation. And so next we're going to go to use case 3. For this use case, we're adding another type of attribute for consideration, location. To begin, we're going to go back and look at that earlier email where Anne sent sample D to Dan. Remember, sample D is only meant to be viewed by users with a top secret clearance, a membership in the Tiger community of interest, and while in the US. And so if a user tries to access this file, even though they may be a member of the Tiger community of interest or the top secret clearance, they're not going to be able to use it when they're not in the US. And so let's jump back and we'll see Anne. And so here we see where she sent this email and it got denied to Bob and Chris, but Dan did get the message. And so if we go down here and log in as Dan in Canada outside the US, you can see that he did get this message. And there's the sample D attachment. But if he tries to open this file, you see he gets this message saying that he's been denied access because he's not in the US. But if we go up here and have Dan log in to a workstation in the US, you'll see his same inbox here with the same message. But if he double clicks on this attachment, it opens because he's now in the US and is otherwise qualified to view the content. And so we can see how location can be used as a valuable attribute when determining access. And so we're now going to take a look and see how SharePoint is another option for sharing these files. And so we'll log back in here as Anne, and we see when Anne is logged in, she sees all the demo files, A through E, and the attributes associated with them. But for example, when we go down to see Dan, and he looks at the same document library from outside the US, he only sees these two files, the unclassified file and the secret file that didn't have a restriction for location. However, if we go back to Dan and the library in the US, you'll see that he also now sees the sample D file while he's in the US. And so we can see how even using SharePoint to distribute the files, we can still manage access and make sure that using a data-centric approach only allow authorized people access to the files. For the final demonstration, we're now going to be taking a look at files that have had rights management protection applied to them. The same rules we used for entitlement management in the other demonstrations apply here. Only authorized users will be able to access the files. And so we're going to be looking at document D, which had the top secret and belonging to the Tiger community of interest and being inside the US, and also looking at document C, which was a secret document that required you to be a US citizen, and then document B, that you could be US or Canadian, but still have a secret clearance. And so to begin with, we're going to log in as Anne. Here you can see we've protected these files and put them out in an online repository where they can be accessed. And so to begin with, we're going to, like I said, look at sample D document, which Anne, because she's in the US and has the right clearance and everything else, has access to this file. But if we go and log in as Dan again from outside the US, even though he has the top secret clearance and is a member of the Tiger COI, he tries to open this file, he gets denied because he's not in the right place. Now we're going to look at sample C with Bob and Chris. And so you remember sample C requires a secret clearance, which they both have, but it also requires US citizenship, which Bob is, but Chris is not. And so we'll start with Chris here, and we'll try to open up sample C. And we see that he is denied access to that file. And we'll go down to Bob and try the same file. And we see that Bob gets access to the file because he met the requirements of the policy. Now we have two other files in here, A and B, and we see that A has not been protected. Because if you remember, A is an unclassified file, and so it didn't warrant protection, and it can be read and shared by anyone. Where document B was it was classified secret, and it's protected. And while everyone in the demo could access sample B because it's a secret file and everyone has a secret clearance, it's still important to protect it, because if the file were to end up in an unauthorized location or network, that's also known as a spillage or a leakage, if that were to happen, the file would still be protected. The content would be protected because it requires an affirmative policy decision to access it. And so if you remove the file from a location or move it to a location where it cannot get that approval, the file becomes inaccessible and it's still protected. So that completes the demonstrations of showing how a data-centric solution can protect your data. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Now we will open it up for any questions. Just to again reiterate a few logistical items. This webinar will be recorded and distributed to everyone who registered after the conclusion. And if you do have any questions, you can use the Q&A button down at the bottom of the Zoom webinar interface to submit your questions by text, and then we will try to get to them. First questions that I have, a couple of them are paired. It's really, are there any situations where a network-centric security model is definitely the way to go and is better than data-centric security? And then vice versa, whether there's any situations where the data-centric security is definitely the right way to go and you don't need network-centric security. I would say that in general, it's almost taking the, I think actually Ryan covered it very well, or had a very good analogy earlier in the webinar about having a gated community, but then still having locks on your doors. I think that although ideally either of those would work on their own, having both provides like it's multiple layers, and then even, you know, that's the best model I think for security is, so just in case one of the protections could be compromised, you can still be protected by the other model. And or it's sometimes referred to as like the Swiss cheese model as well. It's like where if you have multiple layers, it's hard for any malicious actor to get through all of the layers. Ryan, Steph, Peter, if any of you wanted to jump in and offer your perspective as well as to you know, when the either data-centric or network-centric may be relatively more important, but at least the way I see it, it's always good to combine both, because then you just have much better security.
So I think you said it quite well. I think your reference to the material earlier on, you know, having both layers to the onion to protect your data is always a good idea. But I think it comes down to a risk tolerance of the organization. So military, I can see from that context, the more layers, the better. From a business perspective, if you're not in military, then that answer may change slightly. But I think from most perspective, the better you can get, closer you can get to the data trying to protect it is always going to be a better result for you.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks, Steph. I will, I know we've gone over our initial scheduled time, so I know that everyone may not have been able to stick with us the whole time, but just leaving it open for a few more minutes to see if there's any other questions before we call it a wrap. Again, there's you can always reach out to all of us, to any of us with any further questions, and we will be sending out a video of this webinar that you can share with anyone else who might be interested. But if there's nothing else, I'd like to say thanks everyone for joining. Definitely want to also thank our partners who were able to join us today and who are able to contribute. But you should be hearing from us soon with a link to that recording and a follow-up to see what discussions make the most sense going forward. So thanks again.